Gordon, I want to get your take on this because there is growing concern as well about China and the relationship that's growing between Russia and China. Just this week, Secretary of the Navy raised concern over our inability, the U.S., to keep up with China's naval fleet. According to Carlos Del Toro, China has about 340 ships right now. So that's 40 more than the U.S. And they estimate that China will have 440 in the next 7 years. The U.S.'s strategy is only to have 350, so 50 more than we have in the next 22 years. And Del Toro also saying this, Gordon, that they have China 13 shipyards. One of those shipyards is larger than all of our shipyards combined, just for comparison. He says that presents a real threat. Do you feel like the U.S. is taking this threat seriously of China, that they're growing their naval fleet to such large numbers?
The United States is not taking China as seriously as we need to, because it's not just the building of the Navy or their armed forces in general. We know that Xi Jinping is, in fact, preparing for war. He's trying to sanction-proof his regime, and he's mobilizing China's civilians for war. And Lindsay, as we know, during the Communist Party's 20th National Congress in October, he appointed what's now being called the War Cabinet. So although we don't know what's in Xi Jinping's mind, we do know that he's getting ready for battle. And they do have a larger Navy than ours. And they are going to and they also have some weapons that we don't have in some critical categories, like supersonic missiles with nuclear-tipped weapons.
Yeah, and we also know that they've been very clear, at least Xi has, or alluding to the fact that they do want to take over, put Taiwan back into what they would consider their reign in the next few years, which would pose a very concerning situation for the U.S. I do want to ask this, though, because tomorrow marks the 1 year of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And there were reports just this week that China is considering giving Russia arms to help supply weapons to them, to Russia. We're supposed to get intel maybe any day if that is true or not. If that is true, Steve, and China is going to supply Russia with weapons, how should the U.S. respond to that?
Well, unfortunately, the United States needed to respond to that a year ago and all along, because China's leaning to one side in this with Russia really was out of the box. There was the Putin-Xi conversation that very clearly seemed to intimate that an invasion was coming. There's all the conversations about sanction proofing that Gordon mentioned, with which I entirely agree. And so the material assistance, I think there is some evidence that that also has been happening. If it increases, it just really undermines the efficacy or effectiveness of NATO and the attempt by the United States with Europe to deter any further escalation. That's very damaging to America's credibility in other parts of the world, really undermines the idea that we would have any kind of effective response to China if they chose to move on Taiwan. And given my lifelong friendship with people there, I dearly hope that they are safe and that China is deterred.
I think that is the great concern here, right? That you have Russia, who seems like they don't fear the U.S. anymore, nor China. And so, Gordon, I guess my question to you would be, if we do think that China, if it comes out this intel proves that China is going to supply Russia with arms, what would make China fear the U.S.? What would be a repercussion that would actually make them scale back?
I think that if the United States were to arm Ukraine to the fullest extent and make sure that they were able to expel all Russian forces from Ukrainian territory, that would go a long way to reestablishing deterrence. The one thing, Lindsay, that we know, and Steve just intimated this, that China is already supplying lethal assistance to Russia. Every day, according to the Breakingdefence website, an AN-124, which is the world's largest cargo plane, leaves Zhengzhou in central China with ammunition and other high consumption rate items. And also, we know from the very beginning of this war that China has supplied military information to the Russians. So, you know, I think China looks at the United States and feels that we're not, we're just issuing hollow warnings and we're afraid to impose costs on China. We need to impose costs on China. It doesn't matter what they are, but the Chinese need to show, as Steve talked about, political will.